much, Satoru and Paola, and also to Nadine, who can't be with us for the actual lecture today. My name is Jonathan Köhler. A little bit of background as to what this is all about, I think, will be helpful. I've been involved in the STRN really since its formation, so for around 10 to 15 years now. And one of the areas that I have specialized in is thinking about methods. And this originally started from when I do computer simulation model of scenarios for transitions, which is a small field within the small field of transitions, really. And a couple of modelers and myself got together and said, okay, how can we promote modeling methods in the STRN? And that slowly broadened out into methods in general. And it ended up with us organizing PhD schools around methodology. And it was really Lea Funfschilling and myself who started that. So we have had now about half a dozen PhD schools lasting a week on methods in transitions, each time with a different emphasis, but essentially including an introduction and some general information, as well as less specialist lecturers. The problem with that is, and they've been very successful events, but because they're designed to be in a physical environment, we've limited the number of participants to around 30. And each year, the number of applicants we've had has been around 100. So we've had to have a very strict selection process. And I think, and we all thought, well, that's a shame that we've had to turn so many people away. And this year, we actually got around to saying, okay, what can we do about this? And the obvious thing is to put 2 online seminars where you can have a lot of people. The actual interaction is obviously limited, but at least we can reach an audience that a broader audience in terms of PhD students and a NEST network than you can have just once a year with a 1-week workshop for 30 people. So that's where this all comes from. And what we are doing, we're still in the process of organizing. So I offered to do a brief introductory discussion really about why you should worry about methods in transitions, and hence my title today, What is Good Sustainability Transition Science and How Do We Know? And we are going to organize a series of webinars given by people mostly who have delivered lectures or organized activities in the methods workshops. We've got a panel of people who have been actively involved in this, including Julia Wittmeyer, Bono Pell, Frank Gales talked, René Kemp's talked, other people like Sarah and others as well. So they will be delivering some lectures, but that's not been organized yet. So this really is an introduction, and we're going to be running a few webinars over the next probably 6 months, and then we'll see how that goes. So firstly, it's very good to see so many people here, and that is really the objective of this. So let's get on with the show, so to speak. So what I'm going to talk about today, and it's going to be brief, so we're not going to have many details, but don't worry about that. I will just emphasize at this point, do feel free to contact me afterwards or any of the organizers afterwards if you want more information or pointers in any direction for these questions. That's the first thing. So I'm going to talk about 3 things today. Firstly, why is a discussion of methods important? And in our field of transition studies, I think it is particularly important. Then, and with thanks to Lea Funfschilling, who pointed this out and has done introductions on this, how do you go about deciding what methods you're going to use? And that depends upon the structure of what you think, your theory about what you think is going on. That's the ontology. And from that structure, how can you measure or gain knowledge to look at this theory or your issues. That's the epistemology. And then talk a little bit about what this means for transitions research in particular. The reason I've got this sort of structure is because transitions research is actually quite an unusual subject. It's unusual in two ways. Firstly, it's new. So the papers really starting at about, I think the first seminal paper from René Kemp and colleagues was or Johann Schott and colleagues was in 1998. So it's been going for only 20, 25 years. And in terms of academic fields, that's very new. That's one thing. The second thing is it's explicitly interdisciplinary. Although there is a strong social science element in the main theories that are being used, it is very interdisciplinary, and it wants to try and look at the economics, the politics, the market development, as well as technology analysis, as well as culture in the analysis. That means it doesn't have a particular methodological home. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. The other thing that's special about it is the problem field that we're addressing. These, what we call sustainability transitions, and words are used such as grand societal challenges or wicked problems, like climate change, biodiversity, resource depletion, etc., etc. And these problems are very wide-ranging, over a long time, and therefore very complex to analyze. So we've got a very complex field to analyze, a new field, and what this has meant is that in terms of the methods that are used, you can imagine all sorts of different methods, and there isn't any one particular methodology or set of methodologies that is dominant. And in particular, when we wrote the STRN research agenda published in 2019, where I coordinated the activity, it's clear that you cannot say what is good transition science. What you can do is give a literature review of what's been done and what we think the issues that want to be addressed are, and that's what that paper did. But there is no way you can say that one method is better than any other method. That means that you have to work it out for yourself. What you can do, obviously, is look at the literature that is published, in particular in the transitions journals, which are explicitly to do with sustainability transitions, and see what's been published. And that is obviously a very, very good guide. But you also have to go back to first principles. And by first principles, I mean here ontology and epistemology. And this is a set of questions that you don't actually, in many other fields, have to think about, really. I started out life as an engineer, and as an engineer, in my case, designing ships, you know what you want to do. You want to design a ship, and you know how big and fast it's got to sail, and you know what the materials are, and you can do computer analysis of the shape, etc., etc. But the problem is essentially predefined, and how you're going to define it and the theory of what you're going to do is there. Equally, but more controversially, in my other field that I've got a PhD in is economics. There are various methods in economics. A lot of them don't talk to each other, but there are clearly defined approaches. And that is not true, in my opinion, in sustainability transitions research. So, like I said, firstly, what you've got to do is work out what you think your theory of what's going on is going to be. And this is what's called ontology. I'm not an expert in this, so feel free to shoot me down if I start saying something you don't agree with or you know more about. And I've taken this very much from conversations with Leah Functioning. But an definition of ontology is it's a branch of metaphysics dealing with the nature of being, the nature of existence, the nature of what's going on. And that is then applied as a set of concepts or categories in some sort of subject area or domain that shows their properties and relations between them. what does that actually mean? There are various approaches to thinking about the structure of what's going on, the ontology in social sciences in general, and this is also taken off the web. I've given the website at the bottom here. Firstly, in one version, you can think of realism, what actually works for you when you're looking at the real world and trying to understand it, just trying to see what's going on. Empiricism, positivism, and postmodernism. And realism then is the view of the world where you have universal truths and facts which you can discover by looking for them. Empiricism is the argument that actually these universal truths and facts don't really exist so universally. You've got to have a look at what's going on. You've got to observe and evaluate the world around you. So this is what's meant by empirically driven. You measure something that you can see. And then positivism argues that you can't actually find very clear facts or truths. What you can do is you have to codify, you have to interpret what you observe. And realism through empiricism to positivism says really your view of the world is that you're looking at what's out there to different levels, and you use what you see to try and understand what is going on, to transform theories about what is going on. And then, though, there is postmodernism, which came from Husserl and Martin Heidegger, which has a fundamentally different approach, which says facts are not rigid, but rather are an interpretation of an individual's observations and conclusions and data. So there is no universal truth or fact. It all depends upon your point of view, your approach. So this is one set of views of how ontology works. And I'll talk a little bit more when I come on to show examples from Frank Rails and René Kemp in a minute. What is my view of the structure of, in particular, sustainability transitions? And I've just got 2 slides on where I think this is coming from. Not particularly original these days. In this slide, you can see, I'm just going to check time, the multi-level perspective and the diagram which made Frank Rails so well known, and is actually a very, very useful way of viewing what goes on in the world. At this point, I always mention the work of Chris Freeman and Contrartive waves and long-term technical change, which is where these ideas really came from. But Frank has interpreted these ideas of niches, regime, and landscape to a very effective way of saying, in this world where politics is so difficult and there's all these things going on, how can we make a radical system change to a sustainable world? Obviously, I'm not going to talk about that more. There's actually an introduction seminar to that being organized as a PhD workshop in February, I believe, from NEST. But from that diagram, you can then start to make statements about what you think the structure of what's going on is. So you have a landscape, you have a regime, you have a niche. And also, if you look at the writings of authors on this, and the book Sustainability Transitions by Grin and Rotmans and Schott in 2010 or 2011 talks about this in detail, and it's a good summary of good summary statement of all this. If you look at what they're writing, you can say that there are different dimensions: landscape, very long-term, high-level regime, what they're calling often in the literature sort of meso regime, so it's somewhere between macro and micro, and then niches, which are then micro, but you've got these different dimensions. and they interact with each other dynamically. They co-evolve, so they all influence each other, and over time, they take influence of each other and feed back. It involves a multi-actor process, so there are lots of different actors involved, different stakeholders, people, firms, politicians, etc. It has different phases of stability and change, and a transition is, in principle, a change from one stable state to another, very, very simplified, from one regime to another, or one regime to a modified regime. It's a long-term process. So if you look at all the evidence, the historical evidence that's been applied to these things looks at somewhere between a 50 and a 70-year time frame. It's open-ended and uncertain, so you cannot find an optimal way, a best way to get to where you want to go, because there are so many different variables at play with this complicated co-evolutionary interactions. We can't predict the future. So there's a question of how you look into the future and how you deal with this uncertainty. And in terms of policy and politics, there is a change or a argument or a discourse about what society is trying to get to, and it involves often changes in values which are contested, and there is always an argument, a disagreement, classically between the regime which thinks everything is great as it is, and the niches which say it's all terrible and you need to change it. I simplify, obviously. But also the idea that we're talking about sustainability transitions, so that defines really a directionality, a normative statement. We want society to become sustainable with the various definitions. And then there is a differential that I always make, is that you can look at historical examples, and these historical examples have really come through scientific and technological development, as opposed to sustainability transitions, which are forward-looking, where you are trying to actively influence what goes on in society to an extent that hasn't happened before. This means, and comes out of a paper in 2018, you can interpret this as the features that you want to represent are non-linear dynamics over time. So it's not a linear extrapolation of what's gone before. There's some fundamental change. You have to represent new systems, which is very difficult. Whether you do it qualitatively or quantitatively, you've got to think of something that's different to the system that there is already. You expect to see changes in social values and norms. There is also, because you have so many different actors and stakeholders, a diversity of opinions, and they're going to make different decisions based on the same information. We've talked about different scales and the interactions between landscape, niche, and regime, different dynamics. And we've talked about uncertainties. So that's the ontology of sustainability transitions for me is these aspects. Epistemology is defined as the theory of knowledge. So how do you find out data? How do you find out about all these aspects of the system that you are studying? In our case, these are socio-technical systems that are niches or regimes. It's a distinction between just saying, oh, I think it's like that, the conversations that you might have in the pub about whether Donald Trump is good or bad, or whether Kamala Harris is good or bad, and a justified belief, and this is the definition from Oxford, that you've used some evidence, that you've collected evidence that is supporting your argument. And for us as scientists, we do have automatically a claim to have some basis for what we're saying. This page is just briefly three references for these debates around ontology and epistemology in transitions. I recommend the book, Reflective Methodology, New Vistas for Qualitative Research, but I'm not going to go into that. I'm just going to briefly summarize two views from well-known exponents of methods and who have contributed to these debates, from Frank Reels and René Kemp. So what does Frank say? This is a paper he published in Research Policy. arguably a bit defensive about sustainability transitions, but that is also an issue that in the social science literature, people often say sustainability transitions is too superficial and it doesn't really have a structured method. Well, his article here argues that it does, and he discusses three ontologies, three structures of what's going on. Positivism we've already talked about. He then very briefly, he then goes on to talk about pragmatism, which is something that's fairly close to positivism or empiricism, where instead of general laws, pragmatism sees theories, concepts, ideas, research findings in terms of how they can be used to define your ideas and suggest or propose measures and actions. So this is very much what engineering does. You say, I have this theory. Does it tell me something useful about the real world when I apply it? If it does, that's good. If it doesn't, you redirect it. So it's actually very much empirically based. And Frank, and I would agree with him here, says, well, that's not enough. And the reason that that is not enough is founded in this idea of critical realism, where there are three domains of reality from Roy Bhaskar. There are the empirical events, the things that you can actually observe and measure or experience. Then, however, there is an underlying causal mechanism that generates these events, the actual is here. So the events that you observe and experienced are the observable manifestations of an underlying structure. And that then is the mechanisms, and they relate what he's called here the real entities and structures with enduring properties and causal powers. So there is a sort of unobservable underlying structure to society, which you cannot observe directly. And in terms of how people or institutions behave, how they think, you can observe what they do a lot of the time, but the underlying there are underlying motivations which might be clear or they might not be, that you cannot observe directly. So then there comes a question of how you relate your observations to what is actually an understanding of the system. And this is where you need a theory. And in this case, the theory that he uses is the multi-level perspective. And that tells you what you can observe in the landscape, what you can observe in the regime, what you can observe in niches. So it gives you some categories to look at. And then, though, it also helps you to put a structure together of how these things might interrelate without you being able to observe them in the short term. And this is particularly important going forward into the future, because transitions are about a change in structure from what's going on now and in the past. So you can't just say, we'll take our empirical evidence, which is by definition now or in the past, and project it forward into the future to tell us what happens. You've got to say, we've got a theory of how things are going to change. René Kemp adds to this. He also talks about positivism, which is based on objective measurement and investigation of statistical correlations, not causations. He also talks briefly about postmodernism, but the bit that he has added here, which is also reasonably well known, is this argument that transitions theory, this MLP, and also TIS and the strategic niche management, and also transitions management, have a middle range theory. So it's somewhere dealing with all these. So it's not really, it includes the grassroots bottom-up level. It also includes what you would call macro levels, whole societies, but it's somewhere in between and relating them to each other. That's one thing. And then there is the idea that you used mixed methods, which uses multiple types of evidence and methods with special attention to what are the causal mechanisms, what René here calls generative mechanisms, real actors and practices, what are the qualitative variables or what are the quantitative variables, and what are narratives. And this is what transition studies often does. And in terms of being consistent in what you do, is an added challenge as a method, because you're not just using one method, you're using several methods, or at least two methods, and you've got to make sure that these methods are either consistent with each other or they fill in the gaps in your structure and tell you how to get empirical evidence in a consistent way with each other, and such that they don't contradict. And an example out of modeling of a problem that can occur is where you have in large-scale so-called integrated assessment models of climate change. So these are computer simulation models. They often include models of economies, where you have a so-called general equilibrium model, where you assume there is an optimal path into the future. And then they have climate science models, which are actually uncertain and forward-looking because they're trying to talk about climate change and system structural change. And these two methods, in my opinion, are not consistent with each other. So the economics that's saying there is a dynamic equilibrium and you can tell a best path into the future is not consistent with saying we have to have an open, complex, coevolutionary approach to modeling what the climate system part of the system is. And then you then have to ask the question for me, okay, in terms of the economics and scientists, surely that's an open system too. So that's one example where a very well-established scientific field of investigation has this contradiction in terms of its ontology at its heart. Let's think, how much am I talking? I've already been talking almost half an hour. So I will just go fairly briefly through this. René used the idea of mixed methods as something that can bridge what he called the schism between quantitative and qualitative research. And this is what I personally find a very interesting field of endeavor. In my case as a modeler, I've just been critical of integrated assessment modelers, but I think having quantitative methods that try and address what's going to happen in the future helps you to be more precise in your thinking. And we've written about this in a paper led by Georg Holtz a few years ago. And I think although transitions is mainly social science and arguably qualitatively based, I think even with the social science analyses, using statistics and numerical methods to analyze your data and collecting data that you can do that with can be very helpful. On the other hand, there are some things that you can't measure. So you have to also accept that qualitative arguments and data are going to be important, and especially when you're exploring very uncertain long-term futures, so having some idea about what the system looked like without a detailed numerical description is also essential. So for me, this bridging between the gap between quantitative and qualitative research is a very important one. Okay, so why am I here? I'm just going to finish off this brief introduction with why I think this is important and why I hope that you guys are all here listening to this. The problem, or rather not the problem, the challenge with doing sustainability transitions research is, as I said, it's a new field with a very complex long-term dynamic, etc., subject area with all these different levels. And it's explicitly interdisciplinary. It ranges from computer simulation through action laboratory research to theoretical papers. So it's covering a wide field of different sorts of approaches to doing science. And this implies that there is no one single method that's going to be the best method. You as a researcher have got to be able to decide what method you're going to use and make a conscious decision. This is not true of many other sciences. I gave the example of engineering and economics, really. But in engineering, yeah, the new methods are really about how much more can you do with the latest new computing power. I simplify, but in transitions research, which is often viewed as sort of peripheral to other fields, partly because it's new and partly because it's interdisciplinary, does face this challenge. You're trying to do something which is address a very, very complex problem without a long history of literature. As I've said, you can look at the literature. There is now a significant body of literature, and yes, you can look at what's been published. But if you're going to do a PhD, it means you've got to do something a bit original. And that means that you've got to not just copy what's gone on before, but you've got to address a new problem or find a new method or whatever it's going to be. So you've got to take very explicit decisions about the methodology and methods that you're going to use. And that's good. It's a big challenge, especially when you're starting a PhD, because you don't have all that background of what's gone on before and what in particular, what the different fields are saying. And that is where hopefully some of the literature that we've built up over the last 15 years is going to be, or 20 years is going to be helpful. But you do have to make a choice. And there's a very wide set of choices. So it's something that I think you have to think about. So you've got to at least address these things, and preferably fairly early on in your PhD. You will need to choose a method. And that method, obviously, is going to come from the particular problem that you want to address. That problem that you've addressed means that you've already thought about the structure of what's going on to form this problem. So you've already got an ontology, and it's good to think about explicitly about what your theory of the structure of what's going on is. And that ontology then is your answer to, what am I studying? What's a regime? What's a niche? What's a sustainability transition? What do I think? How am I going to interpret these concepts in terms of a concrete structure? And this is also a challenge, because if, in one sense, sustainability transitions theory is very simple. It's that diagram. That's what Frank's genius was. He's got a fairly simple diagram. It's got a landscape, regime, and niches, and they interact with each other, and a niche can either influence or take over from the regime. End of story. That's the end of the story. But what does that mean for you doing detailed, explicit research? What do you mean by your regime? What do you mean by your niche? How do you think they can interact? What do you mean by landscape? Who is involved? What is involved? All these detailed questions you have to answer for yourselves in your research. And that then is, for me, the beauty and the difficulty of sustainability transition research. It's got this idea, this very fundamental idea. I was going to call it simple, and its presentation in that diagram is simple. But actually, when you start doing it and you start trying to unpack all these things, it gets very complicated. I will end it there, just to say I hope this has just given you a feel for the sorts of issues that we are thinking about in our methods and our method search and our method seminars. As I say, we'll be giving we'll be running method schools in the future. We've got one for 2025 at the beginning of its planning phase. And we're still unsure about who and what and where, but there'll be more details fairly soon. We're also going to have some more webinars about some specific aspects, qualitative research, living labs, I think, some quantitative methods. And I hope that you'll at least have had a bit of interest awakened from what I've said today, in the sense that you're going to go away and you're going to think about, not just about what you want to do and what your theme, but how you're going to do it as well. Thanks very much for listening. I'll stop it there. And if you've got any questions, put them in the chat, and I'm looking forward to a discussion, or like I said, do feel free to get in contact with me or any of my other colleagues when you've got methodological questions in the future. Thanks.